5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Bernanke, welcome. Chairman Volker, welcome. Chairman Bernanke, I've been an outspoken proponent of having a Federal Reserve that restricts itself to the conduct of monetary policy tied to specific inflation targets. In your testimony, you posit that it is, I believe, a critical element of conducting monetary policy to have the prudential regulator role. And I certainly have an open mind to that argument, but isn't our own historic evidence and international examples, isn't the empirical evidence kind of murky? If you look at the UK, if you look at Japan, if you look at Germany, clearly they did decouple the two. They had similar economic challenges that we had. We didn't decouple. So can you please elaborate on the evidence that is out there that might be convincing to members of this committee?
Well, Congressman, those three examples are quite interesting because, as you point out, in each case there was a decoupling to some extent of the regulatory function and the central banking function. I believe in all three, certainly in Germany and the UK, the current trend is very strongly towards giving back to the central bank the supervisory authorities. And indeed, in Europe, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is being made essentially also the financial stability regulator for the entire continent. I think the perception was in each of those countries that moving the central bank out of regulation deprived it of information it needed to be effective in the financial crisis, including executing its lender of last resort function.
But Mr.
And
Chairman,
so again, in each case, the tendency is to go back towards combining.
But clearly we have not decoupled here, and yet we did not avoid the panic, we did not avoid the recession.
That's absolutely right.
So what should I derive from that?
Well, the question is, can we identify problems? And I'd be glad to. I've already tried to identify some. I think there's some in the structure of our regulatory system, and there's some in the execution. Certainly there were problems, and I'm not saying this is the one and only issue, but I think the lessons of history are generally on the side of having integration of monetary and supervisory functions.
On the next panel, we're going to hear from Dr. Meltzer, who's sitting over your left shoulder there. I noticed he was kind enough to quote me in his testimony, so I'm going to return the favor. I looked through his testimony. He says, quote, "Setting up an agency to prevent systemic risk without a precise operational definition is just another way to pick the public's purse. Systemic risk will forever remain in the eye of the viewer. Instead of shifting losses onto those that cause them, systemic risk regulation will continue to transfer cost to the taxpayer," which clearly again takes us back to the whole question of too big to fail. So I guess I have a two-part question here, and that is indeed the concept of a systemically significant firm, is it really in the eye of the beholder? And if so, in order for you to execute your charge of maximum employment and price stability, is it not counterproductive to have any type of designation of a fund that creates the impression, again, that there are firms that are too big to fail? Is there not another method, a resolution authority, as you have argued for, that would avoid creation of an explicit fund? And would there not be could not the proper application of capital and liquidity standards be used in order to avoid the designation of too big to fail, but essentially solve the problem?
I think what you just said was very, very cogent. I agree with most of it. I think the fund could very well be exposed, which would mean that the industry, not the taxpayer, would bear any cost. I think it's very important to have tough ex-ante regulation on capital and liquidity and other aspects to make sure, you know, if an institution threatens the entire system, if it fails, we need to be especially careful with it and make sure that it's safe as possible. But in particular, going back to a question that was raised earlier, we really have to address too big to fail. And that means that the resolution regime that we devise has got to be one that make sure that certainly all the providers of capital, including subordinated debt and convertible capital and so on, will be wiped out, that they will not be protected, and that the authorities have the ability to go further up the obligations to the extent that it's consistent with stability. So we need to create market discipline. We can only do that if people actually believe they're going to take losses. We didn't have the flexibility in '08 when we were dealing with these crises. We didn't have the flexibility in many cases to impose losses without creating the bankruptcy that we were trying to avoid. So with a well-designed resolution regime, we can impose losses, and that will bring market discipline back to the system.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from New York.